Day 312, November 8th, Believing 5, Faith God Accepts, 1 John 3 verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son Jesus Christ, and love one another, as he gave us commandment. 1 John 3 verse 23. In today's study, we are going to be examining two miracles which are so intertwined that we can hardly separate them in our study. As we will see, they each have much to teach us about faith. At this time, Jesus was in Capernaum, and a ruler of the synagogue named Jairus approached him and fell down at his feet. He pleaded with Jesus, saying, "My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live." Mark 5 verse 23. There are some who have claimed that Matthew's Gospel contradicts Mark and Luke. This is because in Matthew's Gospel, Jairus tells Jesus that his daughter is already dead, whereas Mark and Luke have him saying that his daughter was near death. However, this is no contradiction, for it is evident that Matthew picks up the dialogue later than the other two Gospels. The order of events probably went as follows. 1. Jesus calls Matthew and eats at his house, Matthew 9 verses 9 to 13. 2. Jairus comes to Jesus, who at the time was most likely eating at Matthew's house, see Matthew 9 verses 14 to 19, and reports that his daughter is almost dead and asks Jesus to come to his house to heal her, Mark 5 verses 22 to 23, Luke 8 verses 41 to 42. 3. A careful comparison of the Gospels implies that Jesus did not immediately go with Jairus, but as in the case of Lazarus, waited for a time. 4. Jesus answers a question about fasting. While answering, Jairus falls before Jesus and reports that his daughter is now dead. Apparently he had just gotten word that she had died. Then Jesus arises and goes with Jairus, Matthew 9 verses 14 to 19. 5. On the way to Jairus' house, the woman with the issue of blood is healed, Mark 5 verses 25 to 34, Matthew 9 verses 20 to 22, Luke 8 verses 43 to 48. When we compare the accounts, it is evident that progress must have been slow as Jesus followed Jairus to his home. Both Mark and Luke tell us that as Jesus followed Jairus, the crowds thronged him, Luke 8 verse 42, Mark 5 verse 24. This fact serves to prove that Jesus was in Matthew's house when Jairus came to him, for the crowds would have been waiting in great numbers outside of the house. Apparently, as Jesus came out of the house, the crowds pressed in upon him. It is probable that many of the people had sicknesses or diseases, and that they hoped to touch Jesus. This is because word had inevitably spread about how people were being healed simply by touching him. In Luke's Gospel, at a point not long before this, we read that the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out of him, and healed them all. Luke 6 verse 19. One of the many people seeking to touch Jesus was a woman who was afflicted with an issue of blood for 12 years. In Mark, we read that she had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse, Mark 5 verse 26. We can only imagine the hope that arose in her heart when, after over a decade of suffering, and after endless unsuccessful attempts to find a cure, she heard of a healer named Jesus. The nature of her illness undoubtedly left her feeling very weak because of the continual loss of blood, and yet she managed to fight her way through the crowd to Jesus. Upon seeing Jesus, she had said to herself, "If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole." Mark 5 verse 28. This is an astounding statement of faith coming from a woman who had hoped so many times for a cure. Often, when we are suffering from some affliction, and when many different hopes come to nothing, we are inclined to become despondent and pessimistic, but this woman was not. She had looked to the devices of men for a solution, but none had helped her. Rather, they had only served to make her worse. She understood the futility of putting hope in man, but she perceived that something was different about Jesus. Her words to herself were not, "I might be whole," but they were, "I shall be whole." Thus we see the confidence of true faith. This was not a confidence in confidence itself. It was not faith trusting in its own believing. Rather, it was faith in Jesus' power to heal. Furthermore, her declaration of faith, "I shall be whole," was not in itself sufficient to obtain the healing. There was a condition, a requirement of some action on her part, the action of pursuing Jesus and laying hold of him in faith. Remember, it is not enough to only declare blessings on our lives. The promised blessings can only be obtained as we pursue Christ and lay hold of him. As this woman, we must press through the crowds of religion until we have laid hold of Jesus for ourselves and obtained the blessing. The confidence of this woman is set forth as an example for us all. We should all say, "If only I may lay hold of Jesus, I shall be made whole." Notice that important word "shall." We see the same confidence throughout the Psalms, and we would do well to pattern our prayers after it. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, so shall I be saved from mine enemies. Psalms 18 verse 3, Mine eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he shall pluck my feet out of the net. Psalms 25 verse 15, I have trusted also in the Lord, therefore I shall not slide. Psalms 26 verse 1, For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion, in the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me, he shall set me up upon a rock. Psalms 27 verse 5, As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray, and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. Psalms 55 verses 16 to 17, My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, he is my defense, I shall not be moved. Psalms 62 verses 5 to 6, Turn us again, O God, and cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. Psalms 80 verse 3, Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. Psalms 108 verse 13. As these verses demonstrate, confident expectation is a key component of true faith. Getting back to the account, the woman reached out and touched Jesus' garment. Mark reports that straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. Mark 5 verse 29. As soon as this occurred, Jesus said, Who touched me? Luke 8 verse 45. Those around him all denied touching him, and his disciples wondered why he would ask such a question when the crowds were pressing in all around him. Peter and the others said to him, Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? Luke 8 verse 45. Jesus answered saying, Somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. Luke 8 verse 46. By this answer, we see that this was no ordinary touch. There were without a doubt many people who were touching Jesus, but this woman had touched him in a way that drew on his power, which is translated as virtue. We will learn why this was in a moment. As Jesus looked around for her, she realized that she would not be able to get away secretly, and so she fell down before Jesus. When the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. Luke 8 verse 47. In Mark's account, we read that the woman was fearing and trembling, Mark 5 verse 33. Her fear may have been of the crowds of Jews surrounding Jesus, for she was ceremonially unclean, and therefore, according to the law, everyone she touched would become unclean as well. We find the law pertaining to her condition in the 15th chapter of Leviticus. If a woman have an issue of her blood many days out of the time of her separation, or if it run beyond the time of her separation, all the days of the issue of her uncleanness shall be as the days of her separation, she shall be unclean. Every bed whereon she lieth all the days of her issue shall be unto her as the bed of her separation, and whatsoever she sitteth upon shall be unclean, as the uncleanness of her separation. And whosoever toucheth those things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even. Leviticus 15 verses 25 to 27. One of the most amazing things about this miracle is that when she touched Jesus, he did not become unclean, but made her clean. And while she might have had reason to fear how the people would react to her being in the crowd, Jesus responded only with words of comfort saying, Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole, go in peace. Luke 8 verse 48. This also is an example to us, for all who look to Jesus in faith are not only made whole, but also receive comfort and assurance from him. Now, Getting back to the reason why this woman was able to draw healing power from Jesus while others only touched him. The answer is found in Jesus' words, "Thy faith hath made thee whole," Luke 8 verse 48. By this, Jesus did not mean that the woman's faith itself was the power that healed her, for she had this faith before she ever touched him. Rather, he meant that her faith, her confidence in the power of God, was the means through which she had received the power that healed her. Remember, Jesus told those around him that he felt power go out of him. Thus, it is evident that the power was not in the faith of the woman, but in Jesus. This provides a wonderfully vivid illustration for us all, because all that we receive from God comes after the pattern of it. We must not trust in how much faith we have, but only in the power of God. Faith is simply the channel through which that power flows freely. Notice that, while the woman may have wanted to obtain her blessing and go away unnoticed, Jesus would not allow her. Instead, he drew the confession out of her before all. The same is true for all of his redeemed people. There can be no secret Christianity. On another occasion, Jesus said, "Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven." Matthew 10 verses 32 to 33. The woman was bold in coming to Jesus, but Jesus also required her to be bold in declaring her testimony. Immediately after the woman with the issue of blood was healed, someone from Jairus' house came near, reminded Jairus that his daughter was dead, and asked him why he was continuing to trouble Jesus. Mark 5 verse 35, Luke 8 verse 49. Jairus had been fighting a battle of faith, for he had begun to ask Jesus for a healing when his daughter was still alive, but upon hearing of her death, had asked him for a resurrection. And remember, he did this in the house of Matthew the tax collector, in the very place where the Pharisees were blaspheming Jesus for being with sinners. He had not only risked soiling his reputation, for he was the leader of the synagogue, but he also had staked everything on the belief that Jesus was able to raise his daughter from the dead. Now he faced another test of faith, for the person who had come from his home was urging him to leave Jesus alone. But Jesus heard this conversation, and said to Jairus, "Be not afraid, only believe." Mark 5 verse 36. Apparently, Jairus held to his faith, and they continued on toward his house. When they came to the house, people had already gathered to mourn for the death of the girl, but Jesus said to them, "Weep not, she is not dead, but sleepeth." Luke 8 verse 52. Some Bible teachers have attempted to claim that the girl was not dead, but Luke 8 verse 53 explicitly tells us that she was dead. Consequently, when Jesus said this, the mourners reacted by laughing him to scorn, Luke 8 verse 53. But Jesus took Peter, James, John, and the girl's parents, and went into the room where she laid. Then Jesus took the girl by the hand and said to her, "Damsel, I say unto thee, arise." Mark 5 verse 41. At that moment, the girl's spirit came again, and she woke up and began walking around the room, Luke 8 verse 55, Mark 5 verse 42. Upon seeing this great miracle, everyone was astonished with a great astonishment, Mark 5 verse 42. Now, having reviewed the details of these miracles, what can we learn from them when we view them together? What is God teaching us through the faith of Jairus and the faith of the woman with the issue of blood? First of all, we can learn how faith pursues its object with unrelenting tenacity. Just as the faith of the men who broke a hole in the roof to get the paralytic to Jesus, both Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood would not allow the crowds to stop them from getting to Jesus. Thus, we have the simple principle, illustrated by the woman reaching out to touch Jesus: those who would have the blessing of God must seek him persistently until they have found him. Secondly, each of these two people had to overcome the fear of men. For Jairus, the temptation would have been to fear what the other religious leaders would think of him. For the woman, the temptation would have been to fear the reproach and hatred of those who despised her for her ceremonial uncleanness. Likewise, all who would come very close to Jesus, all who would lay hold of him by faith, must forsake the fear of men and be willing to humble themselves in the sight of the Lord. Thirdly, we learn from these miracles that God accepts faith, regardless of where it is found. Jairus was at the very top of Jewish society, for he was the ruler of the synagogue, but the woman was at the very bottom, being unclean and therefore prohibited from coming into the synagogue. Fourthly and lastly, we learn that faith has confidence in God where others do not. Both Jairus and the woman received their miracles because both of them believed that Jesus could and would heal. So then, in conclusion, our faith must be tenacious in the face of obstacles and bold in the face of fears. Also, we must trust that God will accept us as we come to Him in faith, and we must believe that He is both willing and able to bless us.